Shrek Treasure Hunt is a collectathon platformer, and it's a very weird one. Instead of having a traditional level 1, level 2 setup, all the levels are accessible as a connected overworld of loading zones, clearly inspired by Shenmue. Each zone has a set number of objects you need to collect. Collect them all and unlock that section's minigame, but watch out for the enemies! Even though you can't die, getting hit still takes a random collectible from you, and you'll have to take 30 seconds out of your weekend to find it again! Beating the crappy minigames will unlock keys. Keys you will need to unlock the final crappy minigame. This would have been nice to know beforehand, because the keys aren't collected automatically. They're only accessible now that you've freed it, ready for collecting. But this made unlocking the last minigame really tedious, because the game doesn't tell you which ones you collected, and all the worlds look very similar. So by the time I only had one key left, it took forever to find. This all could have been avoided if the game told me about the keys. By the time I figured it out, it became very inconvenient. So only bother playing this if you're fascinated by the consistent cursedness these early Shrek games had. Seal of the Pharaoh is a dungeon crawler RPG, and it remains a 3DO exclusive to this very day, and that pretty much tells you everything now, doesn't it? Like many others in the subgenre, you traverse mazes in a simplistic grid-based system giving the illusion of 3 dimensions. You pick things up one place and use them other places. You fight turn-based battles with respawning enemies, and it all gets very mind-numbing. All throughout my life, I never realized that every maze can be eventually solved by hugging the wall, and something about this game made my brain click. I assume other games like this make it very difficult so that its dreadful repetition will be hidden with your intense desire to survive, but the whole game's really easy once you know what you're doing, and it's made even worse with a soundtrack that's so annoying that there's a dedicated button on the controller just to turn it off. Just to properly complement the feel and style of the gameplay, the length of each song ranges from 2 to 4 seconds. Here's every song in the game looped twice. Now imagine a lot of those looping for an hour each. The only thing that kept me playing was its presentation. All of the characters are pre-rendered sprites, which goes well with the fake 3D, and they're also voice acted, and it is delightful.
Give me some money!
I really like the atmosphere in weird early CD games like this. My computer has a disk drive, so maybe I should look into some old PC games. Ooh. Rascal Racers is a Mario Kart clone that leaves an average first impression. It has 8 different characters to choose from, but don't be fooled, there's no exclusive animations or lines of dialogue for any of them. There's not even any grunts, because that just might show a tiny bit of soul. There's 3 courses to choose from, each with 3 tracks. Completing the Crystal and Magic Cup in first place unlocks new characters, just in case 8 wasn't enough for a game with only 3 courses. But completing the final cup unlocks the hardest difficulty. You might think this could both increase the game's pathetic length and give you an excuse to play as more of the characters, but all the trophies have already been won, and beating the cups on hard doesn't unlock anything else. There's not even an indication of any kind that you did anything. Couldn't they just put another trophy next to the one that's already there to give you the slightest motivator to get more than 20 minutes out of this? How did they think it was okay to release something this unfinished in 2004? Is what was going through my head before I did some research on the Googles. Apparently this is only the go-kart tracks in a much larger multi-genre racer in a similar vein to Diddy Kong Racing. There were 4 different vehicles with entirely different playstyles, and each of these were later released as their own separate games without the adventure mode connecting them all together. Why didn't they evenly distribute the characters to each of the games? Only having 2 per game with another 2 unlockable would fit a lot better with the 20 minutes of content, so honestly, I'd prefer it. But I'm getting sidetracked. Screw you guys, port the full game! Tripped is an incomplete demo of a puzzle game released on a system that had no quality control. I reviewed this game a few years ago, and I complained about it being way too complicated, and due to it being featured here, clearly something must have clicked. Probably shouldn't have reviewed a game I didn't know how to play. Makes you think. The arcade mode is just an endless loop that barely gets any harder before it reaches its max difficulty, so that's definitely not how you beat it. But the versus mode has you select one of 8 opponents, each with their own difficulty. The weakest one is an activist. Beating them doesn't really feel like winning though. The game gives you a point, then then the choice of facing him again or going back to the title screen. You don't even have to face the weakest first. Everything's selectable from the get-go. There's no ending. There's no credits. This is barely even a game. I won a round against all the characters. That's the closest thing this game has to a conclusion, and I did it, so moving on. Ice Age Scrat's Nutty Adventure is an unfinished demo that, despite coming out in an era where it's ever so common to finish the game later, they never did. There's little to no music, there's zero reason to fight the enemies, and you might just fall through the floor, who knows? It's also way too easy, with a checkpoint after each and every obstacle you pass. Not that you'll ever die, because you become invincible if you jam the attack button. It's kinda charming in a mediocre fan game kinda way, but only kinda. Sonic Chaos is one of the games in the Alternate series released on Sega's 8-bit consoles, and for the longest time I thought this was considered the best one, but both IMDb and GameFAQs have it rated the second lowest. Now that I've actually played it in all of its 20-minute glory, I can kind of see why. While it's definitely not as bad as Sonic 2, no idea what they were smoking, it's still on a console that can't run it. Showing off the speed of the Sega Genesis was the reason Sonic was made, and the processor on the Master System is less than half of it, so the game is plagued with slowdown whenever there's anything on screen. It runs considerably worse than what came before it, on the same console even. The inconsistency of your speed gets rid of a lot of the fluidity in the controls, and if it weren't for the ridiculous amount of continues you get, I definitely wouldn't have been able to beat it. Spawn in the Demon's Hand is an arcadey boss rush style arena fighter, and my god, this was a huge waste of time. Each level throws enemies at you for 30 seconds at the very most before sending in the boss. The only true obstacle is the timer. Getting yourself killed only takes time away, and when time runs out, you have to start the level over. There's only 14, which is lame enough, but what's even worse is the game hiding the last 7 behind playing with a teammate. Why? What if I want to play alone? And I do! You unlock new characters depending on which one you beat the game with, even if you play it single player, so being dissatisfied with the 20 minutes I got out of it, I set to unlock every character. But since there's 36 characters in total, that would take quite a while to do with all 14 levels, so I only played with a teammate when the character I chose was so terrible there'd be no way I could possibly beat it alone without changing the difficulty. I learned only after playing the hell out of it that there's 5 characters you can't unlock by simply beating the game, which was very frustrating because there was quite a few characters I beat the game with that it didn't reward me for. At the time, I assumed the last 5 characters would be unlocked when I beat it with everyone else, but nope. To unlock the other 5, you must beat all 14 levels without using a single continue 15 times! Hell no, I'm not doing that! I already made a pact to not change the difficulty, and that would be the only way I'd have the patience to do it. Screw it, I already beat the game 31 times, it counts! And now as I'm writing this, I learned online that there are character endings when you beat all 14 levels on the hardest difficulty, so does it count? I'm adding it to the list anyway. Destroy All Humans is a remaster of a game that for once actually needed it. And since the industry is in the phase where you'll have a harder time thinking of a game without one, I appreciate that they finally chose one that's kinda bad. And I double appreciate that they made actual improvements to the gameplay instead of just settling for those shiny new graphics. The first game in the series I played was Path of the Pharaoh, and say what you want about it, but had some damn fluid controls. So it was pretty rough going from that to playing the original that was supposedly better. It was like playing Arkham Asylum after playing Arkham Knight with how limited the movement was. But the remake actually takes the controls from Path of the Pharaoh, which is very surprising because everyone seems to hate that one. It's common for developers to make changes against the fans' wishes, but it's not often that it's done because the fans are wrong and stupid. No backlash happened, of course, because all they had to do was not advertise it as such. I bet if you told the fans who love this remaster the truth, they would fall into a deep depression. So, since now the game is no longer painful to touch, I can now appreciate how poorly designed it is outside of the controls. Almost the entire game feels like a tutorial with how little destroying humans you actually do. And on the off chance you do come across an action mission, it's one of those games where it's completely unfair if you don't upgrade your character, but it's way too easy when you do. When your game has that problem, you should just start from scratch. It was a respectable attempt, but being the best version of Destroy All Humans doesn't all of a sudden make it worth it. Green Lantern Rise of the Manhunters on the Wii is a completely different game than its HD counterparts, and although it's not much of an achievement, it is better. As opposed to the God of War clone on PS3 and 360, this one's more of a platformer and a very easy one. Usually games this easy are mind-numbingly boring to get through, but it's just too much fun to control for me to care that much. The ability to fly along with the very inexpensive upgrades pretty much makes the entire experience a mindless power trip, but it works thanks to how short it is. Presentation-wise, it's generic as sin, but what can I say? I had fun. Return Fire is a top-down game of capture the flag. Seriously, that's not a side mode, that's the entire game. But it's a fun game of capture the flag! Each map gives you a set amount of 3 different types of attack vehicle. You must use them to provide safe passage for the 4th type that's used for bringing the flag hidden in each level. Beating a level unlocks a higher tier of levels, which is strange. Each succeeding tier is 8 different maps, but only beating one is required, which makes for a fairly short game. It has no real ending, so being dissatisfied, I wanted to beat all the other levels, but they don't even mark which ones you've already beaten, so you have to keep track yourself. And not only that, but as you scroll through the available maps, they loop, and half of them are mirrored, and the mirrored aren't even lumped together, they're mixed in! I'm not beating mirrored levels, and I'm certainly not gonna write down levels I've beaten and what ones I don't want to beat. What a waste of resources! Almost 3/4 of the maps won't be played, almost 7/8 including the mirrored filler. Yet another 3DO game that feels like a beta. Guardian War is one of the only RPGs on the 3DO, and I'm glad it got at least one. The 3DO's hardware is just powerful enough to run 3D games, but that's only if it's in the hands of talented programmers. Most of the time, it's just a blend of pre-rendered sprites with a flat 3D ground, all while managing to still run poorly, and this is no different. But the Windows XP style is very charming nonetheless, although after a few minutes, you will have to take some of it away by turning off animations, because holy crap, getting through a single battle with default settings is a slog! Very late in the game, I figured out an exploit that makes the game so easy it's hilarious. I'd need to replay the game to figure out to what extent, but if the Iron character is leveled up enough, you can send him alone on the battlefield and win every single fight. All you need to do is attack an enemy and then back up all the way. If a character's speed is high enough, you can take enough steps back to exit the fight. Their health will be the same as it was when you left, so just walk up to them and do it all again and again and again. There's nothing they can do! I enjoyed the game quite a bit up until that point, so I don't really know how to rate it without knowing just how much of it can be beaten that way, but I have to put it somewhere. Luxor 3 is a ripoff of Zuma, plain and simple. But none of the Zuma games were released on Wii, so I guess that gives it a reason to exist. Of course, since this is on the motion control system, it forces you to play with the pointer, and it works great for the first couple of minutes. Once in a while, your cursor will freak out and lose its calibration. All I can do is move the remote all over the place and hope I can recover. It usually only takes a couple of seconds, but by the time you get to the harder levels, it gets very frustrating. I don't know if it's the game's fault or my sensor bar. I can't think of any other Wii games that uses pointer controls as much as this one does, so I can't do a concrete test to find out, so I'll just blame it on the game. Plus, if it's really just the sensor bar, then it's on them for forcing you to use flawed hardware. The game's still fun. It would just be nice if they let you put the remote sideways. New Super Mario Bros. U is just New Super Mario Bros. Wii, and it's not even with a fresh coat of paint because each world uses the same textures and songs. It was also shorter, with only 7 worlds compared to the predecessor's 8, and on top of that, the middle of the game is a branching path before going to the next world, meaning you have to backtrack if you want the game to be longer. But why? What if I want the game to get gradually harder as I go along? What if I don't want to play for an hour longer just to get to the same destination? I mean, I also want the game to be a decent length, but both choices sound wrong, so don't make it a thing to begin with, butthole! It's still fun, but all that fun is just taken from the last one, so play it if you want more, even though it's barely even a different game, so it'd be like playing it twice. I guess play this if you don't have a Wii? After writing this, I figured out that there actually is as many worlds as Wii, but the game skipped one because I inadvertently beat a level wrong. Awesome. Shantae Risky's Revenge is the second game in the franchise, and it was interesting to see where the series was before it became embarrassing to admit playing it. But design-wise, it's pretty bare bones when comparing it to the newer ones. I was kind of underwhelmed after finishing it, but I was probably expecting too much. It's put together perfectly fine, minus one time where the hint giver told me dated information that got me stuck looking in the wrong place for hours. Tetris Effect was an attempt to turn Tetris into a surreal experience, and it mostly lives up to that if you don't play on one of the harder difficulties. But if you want something that's a little less easy than normal mode without it getting so fast that your piece spawns exactly where it would land if it had not spawned there, you're out of luck. Rapidly rotating my piece while trying to climb up block geometry fast enough before I run out, while simultaneously trying to remember which shapes you can even do that with, isn't fun. And I'd gladly sacrifice my ability to move blocks after they land in exchange for them moving a bit slower. It sucks, because the new zone feature is a great addition to the already perfect formula. Too bad there's no difficulty setting to do it justice. Captain Toad Treasure Tracker is a simple, charming, but underwhelming game at a time where that's all Nintendo knew how to make. The gameplay was taken from the Super Mario 3D World bonus levels, and to be fair, there was plenty of room to expand it, and they did, but it's not what one would call a climactic experience. I mean, the final boss is just you fighting the second boss again, and the third is just the first. And fourth. Jeez, it's one thing to reuse the game engine, obnoxious camera and all, but the reused game keeps reusing itself. Uncharted 4: A Thief's End is the grand finale of the franchise, minus the spin-off starring the character that almost ruined the story. Yeah, I'm not bothering with that one. It has the same pacing issues I had with the ones before it, but it's more bearable for me now that I can ooh and ah over those fancy new graphics. I'm still not a big fan of cinematic games like this, but despite a couple of annoying flaws in the story, this is probably the best they come thanks to the extra variety in gameplay, keeping it fresh. Astro's Playroom is the first game to be built into its console since Face Raiders and the 3DS, and I think that this might even be better. It was made with the sole intent of showing off the wacky new features of the PlayStation 5's overpriced controller. But instead of simply making a minigame collection like Nintendo's done many times in the past, it's a fully fledged adventure with gimmick sections in each level. The monkey climbing is by far the coolest. Sure, it's only a couple of hours, but with a short runtime comes no filler. And despite it being a bit too easy, its style more than makes up for it. Titanfall 2 is a sequel to an online-only FPS, so I've never played that one, but this one's a campaign. Oh, cool! Too bad it's so dang short because it plays so well. Piloting giant robots is awesome, of course, but the gameplay's just as fun outside of the machine. On your feet, you can dash, slide, double jump, wall run, double jump from your wall run to get to another wall to run on, and you can even time travel between different dimensions before and after an apocalypse, which makes for some pretty creative level design, and I do mean some, as it's taken away the next level and never brought back. At least have a challenge mode where I can play around with it more. There's only 9 levels and that's it. Like Doom Eternal, it achieves what very few shooters can and makes it fun to simply move around, but it's only about half the length, so it's not quite the experience that one was. A Hat in Time was a crowd-funded 3D platformer that takes a lot of inspiration from Mario Sunshine. Good choice. It is the best Mario game after all. It's one of those games that has that distinct, quirky girliness that can only be made by a woman. Or a pedophile. Let's see who made it. So, he's a pedophile. So, just like the terrible modern Shantae games, it's embarrassing to admit liking it, and also just like the terrible modern Shantae games, I like it because it's quite good. Above all else, what really stands out is the game's variety. Every world has a completely different structure than the last. There's even substantial variation within the missions of each world. It has plenty of flaws, but it's still probably my favorite in the genre. Well, my favorite in the last decade, anyway. Spider-Man is currently the highest regarded Spider-Man game among the countless Spider-Man games that have been released in the last 50 years, 10 of which have the name Spider-Man. What one did I play? Everything from the combat, the stealth, and the web slinging are all fantastically implemented. Its only downside is its insistence on being a modern video game. There's a lot of sections where you play as people who aren't Spider-Man, and I always want to skip them. Half of the time they're stealth sections, even though there's way more fun stealth to be had when you're Spider-Man. And the other half is way worse. You just walk around a room looking at stuff until you eventually find the right thing to look at. I don't care if it's cinematic and establishes plot points, put it in a cutscene. Not that I would want any more with that self-righteous bimbo.
So what's your end?
I don't have one. I just listen. For the record, what do you know about the file those masked men stole? I don't. What about the long history of stolen goods Fisk has laundered at this auction house?
Apparently she gets even worse in the sequel. Ugh. Batman Return to Arkham is a remaster of what many consider to be 2 of the greatest games of all time, and what I'll consider to be the greatest Batman game of all time. No matter what their opinion is, it's always going to be one of these 2. Except for me, Arkham Knight will always be my go-to. But replaying these made me appreciate them more, especially Asylum, which I didn't used to be a fan of. It does take a while to get used to activating detective mode with the Batmobile button, though. I also wish they added the ability to play it with original graphics, because the new lighting and textures arguably make them look worse, especially in cutscenes. But at least it runs a lot better. Well, Arkham City does. I don't remember if Asylum had frame rate issues on 360, but you know what I do remember? All online services being shut down permanently, so thankfully all the DLC for these games are included on the disc, so they won't be lost to time. Very worthwhile package. Buy it!